Nelson did a really good job of organizing the trip. I mean, we met with relevant people in a number of areas. So, for instance, we met with people in the Department of Agriculture in the state of Colorado. We met with those people who were involved in revenue collection. We met with those persons in health in those areas. And so it was a very broad conversation. I don't know if you had the opportunity to also follow some of the articles.
Yes.
Because there was a daily news reporter that followed us everywhere. I think her mission was to see if anybody was going to smoke any cannabis as well, you know. But it was a very productive trip from my point of view. And the good part about it was you got the opportunity to speak with them and they were very frank. They didn't try to hide any issues at all with some of the challenges that they were having and some of the successes that they've had. Now, one of the distinctions between us and Colorado actually gave an entitlement to marijuana for medical use in their constitution. They actually had a constitutional amendment, Amendment 64, that was enacted by the people, and it's in their constitution. So a challenge for them is that after they put it in their constitution, of course they had to provide for how you would access it. And so they have a registry, and what they do is that if you are on this registry, which means that a doctor has to certify that you have a medical condition for which benefit could be derived from the use of marijuana, and if you are on that registry, you have a right to grow marijuana. You are limited to 6 plants, but you have a right to grow. Now, since one of the indicators is people who are suffering from immune deficiencies, then there are those people who are unable to grow. So Colorado created a category of caregiver, and that person can grow for the person who has a medical need, but who is unable to grow for themselves. And that is one of the biggest areas of problems for them, because at the point that we were conversing, they had a registry that already had on 116,000 people who qualified to use it medically. And so you have 116,000 growers or caregivers growing for those persons. And that is a constitutional issue. So you can't change it without a constitutional amendment as opposed to a right that is enacted by statute. And so that is the biggest area. They're in fact having less problems with the legalization component than they are with the medicinal, because of that far-ranging provision that gives so many people, once they are qualified, the right to grow marijuana.
Well, one of the things that people would question with over 116,000 people growing, how does Colorado come up with the distinction that these people might actually need this? Or some people are questioning, hey, what's the guarantee this isn't fraud? Just to be able to grow and say, hey, I'm sick.
And that's a good question. They actually have the listed conditions that it is applicable to.
Because I can wake up today and say I'm depressed. And I need to smoke just to relax.
You're right. But you see, there's a very real problem in that here's a plant that you are prohibited from growing, and researchers are prohibited from doing research on. And so you have that limitation right there. So a lot of the treatment of it has to be by anecdote. And these are notations that people have used, the data that they have generated from the actual use of it in certain conditions. So it's like a catch-22. How do you get to the point where you can benefit from the knowledge when you're prevented from getting that knowledge to begin with? So institutions like universities are afraid to conduct research because they don't want the federal government to yank whatever federal supports or grants that they get because they're violating federal law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it really is a catch-22, and so it is going to continue being, in many ways, an emerging science, because as more and more, I think what's a very, very important thing for us to consider is that if you look at the landscape, some of the guests that we interacted with in Colorado, they were like, you know, the genie's out of the bottle. 23 states now have medical statutes, and 5 jurisdictions, including 4 states and the District of Columbia, have full legalization. And just 2 days ago, the House in Texas passed a bill for legalization. So it's like, this is the landscape, this is what's happening. And so at some point you have to decide what you're going to do. And I think based on the referendum, I think the challenge for the legislature now is to come up with a good statute for the use of medical marijuana.
Was it like almost 60%?
56%.
Almost 60.
Yeah.
That felt that it was important enough to look at it and say, hey, this is something that we wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
But then the question says, well, okay, if you have a population and it's almost 50-50, because when you go to 56, that's 6 percentage separating from just saying it's 50-50. What are your thoughts in regards to that? Is that 6% really a push to say that the community is really looking forward to this?
Well, I think as more and more education is shared, I think, like for instance, one lady said to me when I came back, she said, Roach, I hope you didn't go up there and go smoke up, you know. Right? That's what. And so I said, you know, I think part of the problem is here you have, if you want to smoke up, you can smoke up in St. Thomas. You don't have to go to Denver to smoke up.
Oh, no, you don't. Even if you don't want to smoke, you go someplace, you're smoking without your knowledge.
Right. But the education component, right? Now, you sit in your living room and you hear some ads that come on, and they're for medications that are approved by the Federal Drug Administration, and they tell you that the medication may cause a stroke, it may cause kidney disease, it may cause liver damage, and then all the prescribed medications you get, you have this long fine print thing of all the things you're doing to your body by taking this medication.
Have you heard the one that said it causes your heart to stop?
Oh, yeah.
And I froze. I said, but doesn't that mean you're dead? Is that a good way of telling people you could die?
You could die
but
from this medication.
They just want to say it nicely. And then I question stuff like that because I'm saying they're here telling you all of these negatives. But then when you hear about other things such as marijuana, you question, well, what's associated with that?
And again, that's the problem. When the bill was presented to even put the question on the referendum, you had testimony from the university. And they talked about the research opportunities that it presented. There was no opposition, really, to the bill to put the question to the voters.
To the people.
Yeah, and so that's, but you come back to that, I'm saying, I wanted to add this point with regard to my response to the lady. We visited in Denver a cluster of colleges. There are like 6 of them clustered together, 6 institutions of higher learning. And thousands of students. Some of them share facilities at these, not universities, colleges and other learning institutes. And the State Department of Higher Learning in Colorado has already approved a 25-course curriculum in cannabis for one of these institutions. So you already have people who are very adept at the cultivation, to learn the cultivation techniques, the extraction techniques, the business of cannabis in terms of regulations, not only nationally but internationally, and all of these things related to the potential for it to be used medicinally. So where you have one mindset of people just in some setting just smoking marijuana versus the research that's taking place, and some of the researchers tell you straight up that they don't use marijuana, and they don't because they don't want anybody to confuse. They're wanting to access it for recreational purposes versus the real science in which they're engaged. And I just believe that you benefit from learning. Now, of course, there's some of the challenges. And one of the challenges is that you cannot use the banks when you have all of these marijuana-related businesses because the banks are controlled by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which basically is a federal structure. And so what has emerged is a largely cash industry in Colorado. I mean, you have the revenue people telling you that people come to pay their taxes. They might have bags of money, $60,000 in a bag or a box or suitcase to pay their taxes. So that is an issue for them because you have a lot of money circulating in the state. Now, but what's actually very encouraging, though, when you think about it, is that they're actually going to have a conversation with the FDIC, and they're discussing with the EPA chemicals that are used for fertilizer and for treatment of, let's say, pests, etc. So the fact that they are even talking with these federal agencies suggests that there will be some movement in how this substance is treated.
Well, what do you think one of the reasons that the banks are very skeptical or really have a standoffish attitude?
No, the banks want the money. Well, it's the federal law that keeps them.
That's the point I wanted you to bring up.
The banks want the money because banks are in the business of making money. And what they're standing aside and looking at is these hundreds of millions of dollars that's not passing through
their institution.
That's right. Where they could lend you and charge you some exorbitant rate of interest and me, etc., etc.
Yeah. Well, that is going to be the part that's going to have to ultimately change for some sort of full acceptance of marijuana, whether it's for legal purposes, recreational or medicinal, because that federal statute is always going to be there. And what are your thoughts? Do you believe that at some point, whether Congress is going to make some effort to potentially remove that, or this is going to just continue on the pattern of being individual states and possibly territories?
Yeah. Well, I think we can look at the outcomes of a couple of things. Mm-hmm. One is that there are neighboring states. Oklahoma is one of them, and I can't remember if Iowa is the other one, but I know one of them is Oklahoma. And they've actually sued Colorado, saying that it's increasing marijuana use by their residents who cross over the border to go get it.
I saw that one.
Right. So the outcome of that is going to be interesting. But I think the outcome of the conversation with the FDIC, these are some of the indicators that we're going to be able to look at as to where the federal government actually stands. Because what you have in Colorado is like, think of it as like a balloon. And the money is the air that you're blowing into the balloon. Is what's so far that you could blow all this money into this balloon because you cannot access the highways to move it from the state to say that you have commerce with your neighbors, and you certainly can't fly it out of the state because those airways are again controlled by the federal government. And so eventually with all of these states either approving it for medicinal or medical or recreational, some statement or movement is going to have to be had by the federal government. And I think we just have to pay attention to what that is.
Well, you find that there's a lot of debate back and forth as to the constitutionality of it based on federal law as opposed to the individual states. Do you think that might have been Colorado's rationale of saying, wait a minute, if we put it in our constitution, we could literally have a debate with you guys and say, hey, this is our state constitution as opposed to it just being a law?
Yeah. I think the interesting thing about Colorado is so many of the initiatives are citizen-led. And this was actually a citizen-led initiative.
Okay.
They even have a requirement that you can't have tax increases without bringing it to the people. They actually have a tax commission that regulates when you can access tax increases, and the people have to agree to those. So it was a citizen-led initiative. But I because that has proven to be the most challenging area for them, the medical component, I think right now they're really seriously looking at that, because having it as a constitutional amendment makes it more challenging to regulate. But they recognize that they've had a lot of issues, particularly with the caregivers. Because, for instance, if you're a caregiver and it says that you can grow 6 plants for each person in your care. So if that caregiver has 6 persons and they grow 36 plants, what happens if somebody in their care no longer needs it? You think they go and report that they no longer need to grow 36 plants?
Well,
right.
Well, then do they have to renew on an annual basis? Because then if there's a no need, then at that time you would have to update.
Yeah. The caregivers are largely unlicensed.
Okay.
The licenses are applied to the.
And then
the
they
ones
don't have
who
to
are-
check back in or
exactly,
anything.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they have to look at some of those things.
But
Now let's talk about Virgin Islands specifically.
yeah, so the question I think you started out with is the revenue picture. And so one of the things that I thought about and what is going to happen is Senator Nelson has what we call the preemptive right to pursue this statute because he has it in first. And so he has a request into the legal counsel to have this bill drafted. Then, of course, the question of input from other senators as it comes to amendments, etc., with whatever version of the bill is actually completed by the legal counsel. But I have thought, for instance, if you have a medical act and you have, we're a tourism capital, and in each of these states where somebody establishes a medical need for it, there are registries of these people. So one thing we could do is right away start thinking about reciprocity. And that would simply be that you set up a mechanism where if you have a medical industry here, that anybody who comes to the territory from one of those states who is on one of those registries, because they will have an identification card that says that, can get a temporary VIE, medical marijuana registration license, for a fee, of course. And it will be linked to the number of days that they're here.
Okay.
And so right away...
So the longer you stay, the longer it costs.
That's right. And the longer you stay, the more you pay, right? So that's one. And then, of course, the government has to license the people to grow the marijuana, because you can't get it from anywhere. So if it's medical, if you approve it for medical use here, it means you have to grow it. And you will determine by statute what the circumstances are under which you will grow it.